thank you first of all. I don't know how much background sort of like I gave you in my. Hang on, this chair is being really weird. If you see me going down, it's the chair being funny. I'm sort of kickstarting this website with some interviews with like tech people, CEOs, and so on about environmental sort of issues, sustainability, climate change, and so on. So the purpose here isn't really to get like an expert opinion from you, but more to have a conversation, which seems to be lacking, right? Mm-hmm. So the way we've been doing this because we'll be like the 7th one now. Mm-hmm. So there's a tiny bit of experience now from my end, but not. It's more of a sort of a conversation about where you stand, where the company stands, what kind of things sort of companies can do internally to sort of create change, things like that, right? The way you've maybe seen kind of cultural things change within other organizations, yours, stuff like that. So does that sound sort of reasonable?
Yeah, I guess I'm probably, it sounds reasonable. I'm not sure how much my opinions are going to chime, but yeah, I'm very happy to say what they are. So yeah.
That's fine. The opinions, it's not so, I'm not looking for opinions that necessarily match mine or anybody else's. It's more about, I think it's something we should be talking about, and it doesn't seem like we are.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, sounds like a plan.
Okay, so just to sort of ease into the conversation, and we'll try to keep this to quite a bit less than an hour. Okay, so I know you sort of have a bunch of stuff, but all right. So let's start with like something sort of simple, just to ease the conversation in. Can you just tell me briefly, sort of like the kind of like history of Redgate in a nutshell, right? And what you're doing now, how big the company is, like just to kind of introduce yourself and the company.
Yeah, sure. So Redgate's a 20-year-old company. It was founded by my good friend Neil Davidson and me, sort of as a project for us to work on. So, we wanted to set up a company, and a lot of it was really about working with each other, because we thought this guy's absolutely amazing and wanted to work with him. So we'd spent a long time saying, what should we do? Before, so it was sort of more like two people trying to find a problem worth solving than it was about a problem worth solving collected some people to work on it. And then it was a self-funded company, so the two of us put some of our savings into it, and a couple of friends chipped a bit of savings in. So it was actually £40,000 was the sort of seed capital for the business.
Okay.
And then 2 years in, we actually paid everybody back, and they were left £100 in the company. So we've turned £100 into a company that now, this year, will turn over about $75 million, employs about 350 people, generates quite a lot of that. We'd aim to make about 30% of our revenue as profit, which we're going to do this year. So it's a fairly, by tech standards, a fairly boring, slow-growing, but sort of solid, sensible sort of company. And what we do is we really help people with their databases. So our job really is and our main area is Microsoft SQL Server. But if you're using Microsoft SQL Server, we try and make it so that we provide a whole range of different bits of software. And if you use those, you'll generally be able to make changes more easily. The data in it will be safer. You'll be able to, the databases themselves will perform better. So we try and basically make it so that if you're a developer or a DBA looking after a database, we make your life better.
Perfect. And I mean, you say it's a boring company, but because I worked for you for almost 5 years, right? I know that it's not actually that boring inside. So you have a very unique sort of culture set of values. You were in sort of Times top 100 list for a number of years. Yeah. How would you describe Redgate internally?
So we've tried hard to sort of maybe balance. We basically want to make it so that as a customer, you get a great experience. So our software really solves a problem for you really, really well. And that if you've managed to get your company to spend some money on it, you're going to be happy about that, because you're going to get the value that you're going to get the value and more back that you're hoping for. Then as an employee, we try and make it so that we're trying to have a promise around basically we're going to try and work together to help you grow and become all that you can be. So we try and take people who are well suited for a role and then give them a chance to grow and develop. It doesn't always work, obviously, but in general, I'm one of the many people that I would say this about. You left a stronger person than you came, and that's a promise we try and keep for everybody. And we try and have a culture that's really about how do we make it so that we sort of talk about it in the sense of we're expecting you to bring your whole human self to work, and that we're happy about that, and we're going to try and make the most of you, and you're hopefully going to make the most of the opportunities we're providing. And I mean, it's sort of almost as simple as this: is that I've got to come to work here too, and I want it to be nice for me. And I want that same thing for everybody else who works here. So I'm in the fortunate position now, I'm a volunteer. I don't have to work anymore. So it's even more important to me now. Like, and the basically boils down to three things. Are you working on problems? And is your work itself rewarding and interesting? So are you actually learning? Are you doing things which are challenging? Have you got these ideas of like mastery, and you're building up a sense of you can work on it? So the first thing is like, is the work itself meaningful, and is it in itself interesting? Then are you working with colleagues who you actually enjoy working with? So are you learning from them? Are they giving you things back? And then is your boss actually someone who's actually helping you? Are you getting something out of that? And then finally, is what the company is doing good? If you imagine the extreme, you might have a really great set of colleagues in a Nazi concentration camp, but it's unlikely that you're going to feel good about yourself because you're doing something wrong. So it also has to be important that the company itself is at least a good corporate citizen, and maybe hopefully a bit more than that.
Okay, good. Which sort of brings us into the topic quite nicely there.
Yeah.
So let me ask you sort of very sort of simple, but maybe sort of tricky question here. Why did you, it would have been super easy for you to say, no, like, I don't have time to talk about this, or I don't have I don't want to kind of like be kind of publicly talking about environmental issues, climate change, and so on. Why did you say yes to me, apart from the fact that maybe you know me and that made you sort of open the email?
Yeah, we're sort of friends, so yeah, I guess part of it's that. Like you, I think it's an area of discussion. I guess I'm also someone who, well, you'll see when I answer your next questions. I think that where we're going with environmental things is a wrong course. So I guess if I can be one little voice and pointing people in the right direction, I'd like to have a go at that.
Okay, what's the wrong course? What do you mean by that?
So I think the focus on carbon dioxide and as the most important environmental challenge is a mistake.
Okay.
And I think that's for two reasons. So there's two reasons. The first is I think habitat destruction is a massively bigger problem for the planet and for wildlife than climate change. And secondly, we already have a very good solution to climate change in place, and we're choosing not to use it. So if we collectively thought there was a problem, we would already have been on it. So we're not. So therefore,
what is the solution you're referring to?
Nuclear power. So we have, my quick pitch on this would be that nuclear power is I guess it's a fairly old technology now, and even the old technology was really good, but the new versions of it would be far, far better. And it's possible to provide everyone on planet Earth with plentiful, cheap power, which doesn't cause any carbon dioxide to be produced. And very few of the people at the top of the environmental tree, the leaders of the big environmental movements and all those rest of them, none of those people are talking about it. So I just can't help but think that their agenda is somewhat different from the one that they're putting forward, because there's such a beautiful solution before us that we could just be using.
Okay, so with nuclear power is something that does come up every now and then in our sort of like in my conversations, but there's a couple of things that sort of like immediately come to mind, right? One is obviously the sort of like associated risks with that, right? Mm-hmm. And secondly is the extraction of the kind of like the raw materials tends to be pretty destructive to the place where they kind of where they're mining the stuff, like to the communities, the wildlife, the and so on. Is that something you've thought about, or is it something which you think
Yeah, let me talk about those two things first. So the first is, let's talk about the risk. So the most recent nuclear accident was in Fukushima. This is a nuclear power station that had been built on in the most seismically active part of planet Earth, and it's right on the coast. And the worst earthquake, I think I'm right in saying, I've got this wrong way around. It's either the worst earthquake on planet Earth for 100 years and the worst tsunami for 1,000 years, or the other way around. But anyway, real once-in-century events here, right next to the most populated, but also experienced country in seismic matters on Earth.
Right.
So normally you have what would be a major earthquake anywhere else happens in Japan, and everyone's like, the building shook a bit, no big deal. So this time we have an earthquake which unleashes a tsunami, and again, they're ready for it, right? And this tsunami kills 130,000 people, I think it is. It's a gigantic number. Okay. Like the sort of disaster that happens to poor countries has now happened to a rich country, because even though they're prepared, they can't. Literally, whole towns are swept away. Bullet trains are swept from the tracks. Every one of them is killed. This whole disaster is happening, and at the same time it's happening, this wave hits the Fukushima nuclear power plant, and they've made a whole series of mistakes in their design. So the biggest mistake was that they put the emergency power supply that was meant to lower the rods into the reactor. Mm-hmm. They put that at sea level, and they protected it with the sea wall, but the sea wall was insufficiently high for this once-in-a-century tsunami. So even though they'd thought about it, the thing they were protecting against was gone. The water comes over the seawall, and basically all the salt water goes into the emergency power supply area and wrecks the batteries. That doesn't work anymore, and the rods can't be lowered. And the disaster that everyone's been avoiding is the meltdown of the reactor, and that meltdown happens. So the next question is, this is an unprecedented disaster. How many people die in this nuclear disaster?
I don't really know how many died.
The answer is none. Not one single person was hurt in this reaction. Not one person has had a moment of their life removed because of this accident happening. So you have the worst disaster in this thing. But like all other forms of power kill you all the time. Far more people have died fitting solar panels to roofs than have died in nuclear accidents in the last 20 years. There's nothing which hasn't got risk in it. So if you're talking about, more people have died by being hit by wind turbines, have fallen off them. I'm not saying that, obviously the worst is coal, of course. That puts particulates into the atmosphere, and they're thinking somewhere in the sort of low millions of people die every year because we power ourselves with nuclear. Gas is obviously far better, but it has a lesser but similar problem.
Yes.
There is no risk. There's no form of power that we can provide for human beings that is completely risk-free. But the closest by far is nuclear. Nuclear is hundreds of times safer than other forms of power. So yeah, it's risky in the sense that if everything goes wrong, you might have to move house. But I mean, that's pretty small compared to, and even by the way, the population that they moved out in Fukushima, they could all move back. They're all fine. It's actually a PR exercise. There's nothing stopping you. You could go and live in Fukushima, you happily live the rest of your life. Everything would be fine. You get loads of radiation when you're in an airplane. So you've got to remember that a lot of the thing is the fear itself. And by the way, Fukushima causes the Germans to shut their nuclear power stations down. They produce loads of coal, which kills huge numbers of people because of the things we were talking about. So firstly, I think the risks are, and this is badly designed old technology. We can do so much better than what's done at the minute. Bill Gates, for example, recently pushed these prototypes out where it's like, look, here's a way of doing it so it could cope with earthquakes. The whole thing's completely sealed. We're not even talking about the current technology. We're talking about 50-year-old technology, which has got all sorts of flaws, but it's still incredibly safe. So I think the risks are real, but they are much, much, much lower than other forms of power. Second is the extraction. I think you're right in saying that a mine for, say, uranium, firstly, it's relatively dangerous stuff, right? So you've got to be careful doing it. And of course, we all know that mining is, at least on a temporary basis, very bad. It can be very bad for the environment where it's being mined. The good news as far as nuclear power is concerned is we've already mined enough to keep us going for the next somewhere like 10,000 years. So although it's true that at some point in the future we'd have to start mining it again, there's such a gigantic amount of this stuff. Like, when one of the things that Bill Gates talks about in his documentary is that there's one site in America that has enough for all of planet Earth, I think, for the next 1,000 years, just in one place.
Okay.
It's all waste. Well, not really waste, but stuff that's currently conceived as waste, which isn't really waste. So for me, the nuclear option is so incredibly compelling, yet is so ignored by people who've been told all the stuff I'm telling you, that you have to ask yourself, why is it they're so unwilling to embrace something that would...
Why is that in your opinion? Because people have different sort of like rhetoric, reasons and so on, but obviously background is more in sort of engineering. Remind me sort of like what your original kind of like studies were, right? It was chemical engineering, am I correct?
Oh, my PhD is in physics, but yeah, I guess, because I'm a physicist, I understand some of the science behind it. The honest answer is I don't think anybody really knows why we're so scared of embracing a technology that could fix climate change. And if anybody really did have a true answer, I think we'd probably be able to solve it. I think the truth is that nuclear power is sort of, it's a bit like carbon dioxide, actually. It's a sort of scary thing that you can't see that's somehow out there, but it's maybe making the situation worse. So I think radiation, the sort of, and also, dramas on the telly, they did the one recently about Chernobyl. Right? Nobody died in Chernobyl apart from the people who were stupidly chucked under the reactor by the Russians. Yet it's still been made as dramas and made much worse than it really was. So I think it's because you can't see it, and also nuclear power, which generates lots of cheap electricity, or very cheap in terms of environmental impact, is also the thing that powers these most terrifying of all weapons, nuclear bombs. So the fact that those two bits of technology and two bits of science are friends of each other is a problem. And I think the final thing is that the history of nuclear power, because these two things are tied up together, there's a lot of secrecy, and so it was overpromised. Mm-hmm. And then there's all sorts of creepy people involved in it that I think have made people off-put by it. But that is a pretty weak. It's a pretty weak excuse when we're saying we're talking. If we're really saying, if you're sincere in the belief that you think that carbon dioxide caused climate change is the major challenge facing humanity, and you're not prepared to embrace a technology that works because of something you saw on Netflix, I think that's unwise of the human race to take that position.
And so just because you mentioned at the beginning that you sort of said the focus on CO2 is a mistake, where the big issue is habitat destruction.
Yeah.
So do you mean that climate change is not such a big issue? Like, you don't think it's as bad as it's being made out to be, or is it just that you think it's solvable? So why are we arguing about?
Yeah, I mean, it's completely solvable. So I suspect, like most of these things, there's a bunch of people exaggerating the badness of climate change, partly because they're trying to drive action. So when there's a model, there's an upper bound and a lower bound. They tend to talk about the worst case scenario rather than the expected scenario or the best case scenario. So okay. I think
okay. So where do you fit on that sort of spectrum, right? You've got Extinction Rebellion on one end and Trump on the other, right? Basically,
yeah, I would say I'm probably. I would say I think. I mean, the actual science behind how carbon dioxide causes the atmosphere to increase its temperature is completely real. I mean, you don't have to have a PhD from Cambridge to say that, but as someone with a PhD from Cambridge, I can tell you that's completely and utterly understood. That's President Trump can say what he likes, he's just wrong if he thinks the underlying science is unright. The ability of models to truly predict the temperature in the future has been shown time and again to be wrong as well. So our current models it's an incredibly hard problem, and they haven't done it yet. And those models have consistently exaggerated the effect of global warming. So the temperature of the Earth is increasing. The models that are currently predicting it have a history of exaggerating it.
Okay.
So, but that doesn't mean it's not real, and it doesn't mean we shouldn't do something about it. It's just you've got to be aware that if you've spent 10 years telling everybody that it's going to be, it's going to go up by this amount, and every year your prediction's wrong by a factor of 2, then over time we have to accept that that well, there's a I don't know why that is, but the underlying truth of the science is real, and the underlying truth of the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is real, and the connection between that and the measured rise in the temperature of the Earth is fairly. There's a lot of very smart people think that, but their ability to predict the future has been appalling.
Okay, so the models are not very good, but what the models are based on, you think is correct.
Yeah, and the reason the models aren't very good is that you're talking about modeling one of the most complex thing imaginable. And it's very, very hard to predict. For example, certain clouds increase global warming, certain clouds decrease global warming. What's really the effect of carbon dioxide makes the number of plants happier. They absorb more carbon dioxide. How do you measure that? I mean, there's all sorts of really complicated things going on here.
Yeah, for sure.
But the underlying truth of carbon dioxide will cause the temperature of the Earth to go up, and if everything else was stable, is completely true.
Okay.
There's no serious person who doesn't acknowledge that. Just that the models themselves so far have exaggerated the problem so far.
Okay, so before we jump into sort of like tech and Redgate and sort of the sort of organizational side of it, tell me a little bit, just super quick, about the habitat destruction thing you mentioned. Why do you think that's a bigger problem?
Well, because why is it a problem? The temperature of the Earth, to my mind, is wildlife can adapt, but if there's nowhere for them to live, it's sort of like that's a much bigger deal. So if we're scraping the seabeds of all living things by the way we're fishing, and if we're chopping down all the rainforests in order to grow products for human beings, then there's nowhere for big fauna to live. So if you look at just about any measure of wildlife numbers, they're in a catastrophic decline right now. And that catastrophic decline is not because the temperature of the Earth's gone up a little bit over the last few years. It's because they haven't got anywhere to live.
Right, yes, and it's all interlinked, because the reason we're cutting this stuff down is also related to the reason we're emitting more CO2, and it's all kind of like interlinked. It's not the same cause exactly, but it's sort of part of the system we're living in, right?
Well, I think I agree that there's maybe some loose connection, but I sort of don't agree with that. I think a reason that there's been massive habitat destruction is that the human population has expanded a lot, and as humans get richer, they absorb more and more resources. So, if human beings are responsible for 95% of what happens on planet Earth in terms of its land use, then that 5% isn't very much for the rest of wild things to live on. So, I think that sort of say, oh well, the consequences of climate change are that there might be some flooding somewhere, plants will grow better here, worse there, blah blah blah. All those things are, honestly, I'm sort of, it's a little bit academic to me, but like, hey, there's nowhere for there's a whole area which was full of wildlife and wild animals that no longer exists because we chopped it down and put a farm there. Well, that's a big deal.
Okay.
And it's a harder thing to measure because you haven't got one number, but it's in my lifetime, the wholesale destruction of all sorts of habitats is a problem, and I think that we should be collectively, as human beings, we need to say, look, we know that we could now destroy everything on planet Earth, and we need to ensure that we're not.
Yeah.
That's for me a far bigger issue than, oh well, maybe if everything carries on, I don't know, carbon dioxide goes up, the half-life of carbon dioxide is going to mean that if, let's say we put a load of carbon dioxide, it might take us 1,000 years to recover that, because the half-life of carbon dioxide means that it's going to come back down again. But there's some, ultimately it's sort of fixable. You wipe out half the species on Earth, or they're nowhere viable to live, and then that's a much longer problem to fix.
That's not fixable. If something goes extinct,
it's not there anymore. Yeah, there's no more blue whales. You can't sort of evolve them again. Well, not unless you're prepared to wait quite a few, hundreds of millions of years. So.
Okay. So yeah. A lot of the stuff that you've been talking about, which is sort of stuff which sort of needs to be tackled at a very sort of, political level, right? Or at least large enterprise kind of level. It's not something like, the decision to build a nuclear power plant or not to cut down the Amazon is not really something that an individual can instantly have an impact on, right?
Yeah.
Which I don't disagree with. There's a lot of sort of political action that needs to take place, but for both of those issues. But then, where does this sort of corporate responsibility come in here? Is it something which is like, oh, this is too big, so we just carry on business as usual? Or is there something, enterprises of any kind, but in our industry as well, in software, you should be doing or talking about?
That's a good question. When does it, when should a company be doing things which isn't, for a better word, a bit core to the mission of the company?
Yeah.
So in my previous career, I was working for Shell, which is the large oil company. And even 20 years ago, there was a huge amount of awareness in places like Shell about the impacts of their activities. So these big companies, inside them, they do, I can assure you, an awful lot of the individuals are more than aware and care. They're also citizens of planet Earth. In fact, they're seeing it close up. So you have this sort of, if you're talking about a company which is right, so one of the ironic things, if you look at where Shell's drilling oil, and this is not just true of Shell, if they're in an area drilling oil, that area will be really, really good for wildlife, because they've got these experts making sure they're not going to be impacted when on the other side of the wall, it's all been chopped down because the locals are trying to have some farmland or whatever it might be. So there's a lot of awareness about the whole thing there. You said about corporate responsibility. What do I actually think about that? It's difficult as a someone running a company when you're trying to make all the things happen in it to truly do things that are going to have any actual impact. So you can dress it up for people, for example, we're incredibly encouraging people cycling to work. I cycle to work myself, and there's at least a bit of that is about, we're going to locate our office and we're going to spend more money renting that office so that people can get to work in a way that doesn't involve having to get into a car.
Okay.
And despite all I've just said about my skepticism about whether we should be really treating global warming as the primary environmental challenge, it's also true that those sort of decisions are taken with that in mind. Okay. We actually, when we looked at Redgate's office, we looked at somewhere just a little bit further out that was less than half as much money to rent, would have done the job just as well. And I said no to that because I wanted us to be able to have normal forms of transport that involve cars. So it is true that you can take decisions which are expensive that do have it. So Redgate spends approximately £1 million a year on its office. It would have been £500,000. Okay. And that would have hit shareholders' pockets. So there are things that you're doing. Sorry, Richard.
The office in the business park, the same one you've been in for a number of years now, or 10?
Yeah, so that when we chose that office, we were choosing between two offices, one of which was far cheaper, 2 miles away, but the only way to get there was in a car.
Okay. So that's like a simple but very realistic thing that like you've done there. Is this a conversation that happens inside Redgate? You're 350 people now. Is this something which is considered, for example, political and sort of you don't discuss politics?
Yeah, so it's difficult because I think in general somewhere like Redgate, which is full of quite right-on people, in order for us to be credible with our people, we've got to be mindful of the things they're caring about and concerned about. So, for example, the choice of office being somewhere which means you don't have to use a car is part of the promise that we're making to people about us being a good corporate citizen.
Okay.
And it's part of a whole gamut of things that when someone's assessing whether they should work at Redgate or some other company, I suspect people look at. Mm-hmm. But we've at least got that partly in mind. If you said, I think if I'm honest to you about that decision and other decisions, really, it boils down to us wanting to look in the mirror and feel okay about ourselves and the decisions we're taking. I'm not sure we're really particularly thinking, let's do an opinion poll of staff and work out whether they think this or this. It's more like we've got a general sense of what people care about and what we ourselves care about, and we're trying to align our decision with those views and values.
Okay. Which is fair enough, but wanting to be okay with looking in the mirror is a fair motivation, I think. Have you had any conversations or any sort of initiatives around, for example, just measuring or offsetting your carbon sort of footprint as a company, like, you know, the actual running of the office, the running of the infrastructure, travel, things like that?
Yeah, Redgate's done various things over the years. So we had this we have this thing called Down Tools Week, which I don't know if you remember, where we basically say to everybody, hey, you don't have to work on whatever you're normally working on. Why don't you do something else for a week? And we have people coalesce around different things. And we've done a few around the environment. We did one, I don't know if you might have been there at the time, but we did one where we're, look, how is Redgate really using up electricity, and what could we do to reduce it?
I think I was there for that one. That was
yeah. So, for example, it turned out a lot of people were leaving their computers on. It turned out that a lot of lights were left on, that people were using dishwashers. So we went round and a team of people tried to work out how could we reduce it. It turned out that, you know, there was we actually turned it so that, as most people have a thing now, where as you boop yourself into the door in the morning, your computer upstairs then turns itself on from a sleep mode so that it doesn't have to be running overnight. So there's things like that which we've done, but I mean, if I'm honest, I think that's more about how we choose to feel about ourselves and make sure, okay, we're not doing nothing here. We are making some steps. But if you said, is the summation of us doing these things actually going to make an impact with the actual problems or the environmental problems the world faces? I think it's sort of window dressing. So, I mean, I think we're doing okay, but I don't think I wouldn't pretend it's working.
I mean, there's sort of two things, right? One is, yes, as a company of 350 people, even if you were sort of carbon negative, right? The impact on the global issue is going to be super trivial, right? It's not even a drop in the sort of like in the bucket, right? But there is this sort of compounding effect of, the more people do this stuff, the more you think about the right things, people might move on elsewhere, take the ideas with them. Seeing other people do things makes things more acceptable or even required. And there are some pretty big companies in tech as well, which, I mean, our industry is completely dependent on electricity, which is one of the biggest emitters, right?
Well, like I said, I don't think it has to be, but yeah, that's true. But if you said to me, what do I think will make the bigger impact? It's things like someone like Bill Gates saying, okay, I'm going to take the fortune that I created out of technology, I'm going to put that to work to really get to the root cause of the problems. I.e., can you generate power can you generate reliable power without having to burn fossil fuels? Mm-hmm. So I wouldn't like, I mean, because I worked in the oil industry, there's more or less insatiable demand for cheap energy.
Yes.
And if a rich person chooses not to burn a bit of carbon dioxide right now, that until it becomes much cheaper to get that energy, or comparable in cost to get that energy from a source that doesn't burn carbon dioxide, I think you've got to expect that fossil fuel to be burned at some point. So if we truly want to solve the problem, we've got to, you can't just use less, because that's all we're arguing about is just stretching out the time in which you're going to do it. Mm-hmm. You've got to get to the root cause of it. And one of the interesting things about working at Shell even 20 years ago was they had these curves where they looked at the cost of different forms of energy production. So it starts off with, coal and oil and gas and other things. So one of the reasons that Shell started investing so heavily in renewables well, they had a moral argument, a bit like the one we're having, mm-hmm. but they also had a financial argument, which is, at some point, we as an oil extractive company are going to be redundant, because it'll be cheaper to produce your energy from renewable means.
Right.
So their view, which I share, is that when we're going to solve the problems of producing lots of carbon dioxide when it becomes cost effective to use other. So you're not asking people to vote with their moral self. You're asking them to vote with their wallet. Would you rather spend, £100 a month on your energy needs by using fossil fuels, or £50 by using renewables, people will find that they want to use renewables. So the challenge really is to accelerate the time in which so rather than trying to be noble, it makes more sense to make it financially viable, I guess. I'd say that's more likely to work.
Yes, it's a bit sort of like depressing that would work better, in the sense that it's sort of it's a little bit amoral on the part of sort of a lot of people, but I understand it. But
well, but it's ironic though, isn't it? Because if you look at America and Europe, there's a lot more morality around climate change than there is in America as a sort of general rule. So I know there's, you're exaggerating the position.
At least at a political level.
So it's ironic, isn't it, that America's done a far better job of hitting its Kyoto obligations than Europe. So, and the reason for that is that they made it really, really cheap. Well, they did really well with fracking, got loads of gas out of the ground. They basically moved oil. Using oil for energy production is a lot worse for carbon dioxide production than gas, even though they're both hydrocarbons for various reasons. So America did far better than Europe, because at the same time America was going from sort of coal and oil to gas, Europe was going from nuclear to coal as it shut down all its nuclear power stations. So you have this irony that everyone's just morally wagging their finger at President Trump, saying what a bad man he is and how does he not respect climate change or this, whilst their own governments have been busy going in the exact opposite direction. So in a way, money can be pure too. It doesn't. There's a, the fact that it was just cheaper to do it that way in America, and America found a way to get that market working effectively, has been good for the environment too.
Okay. Yes, I have to do a couple of like mental somersaults there to maybe sort of.
Which is weird, isn't it? You'd have thought, who's been better for the environment? The Americans or Angela Merkel. You'd have thought Angela Merkel, she's a fair she really understands stuff. But she was the one who shut down all the nuclear power stations in Germany. Perfectly good working things that had a 30-year lifetime or a bunch of time left. Shut them down and burn some coal.
I suppose it depends what you replace them with, right? Yeah, exactly. Okay, let me ask you one last thing and then we'll wrap it up. So I've attended a lot of conferences, software events, expos, meetups, blah, blah, over the last, 10 years. I've racked up a lot of like CO2 emissions in flying and all of that. So, yeah. But one thing which I sort of noticed is a lot of these events now talk a lot more about, say, non-core business stuff, right? Like diversity, for example, or pay gaps, or things like this, inclusion, company culture, and so on. Environmental issues are not a topic that you typically see in software events, meetups, and so on. Should we be talking about this over there? Is it something that is not relevant to tech to talk about as a community, or should we be seeing more conferences having at least tracks or workshops or something?
Well, I guess you'd probably expect me to say this, but no. I don't think you can do much about it. So why is humanity producing carbon dioxide at a scale which is going to cause the planet to heat up, even if we maybe slightly disagree about how quickly and how far it's going to go? The reason for that is that we're refusing to use a great technology that's available to us right now that would solve the problem. And secondly, there's an awful lot of people in poor countries who would rather live with the Western lifestyle than with the current lifestyle, and those people are going to want to have cheap energy available to do it. So us sort of sitting around a room talking about how bad it is isn't going to do anything about it. So yeah, you're sort of wasting your time. I mean, it's sort of harsh, but if you want to affect the, assuming you think this is an important measure, which like I sort of said, I'm not sure it is, but if you said, I want to do something to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide human beings are putting into the atmosphere, going to a trade show and talking about the environment isn't probably going to do anything, no matter what you come up with. I don't think there's a solution that can emerge from that that's going to solve the problem. So I mean, you might meet like-minded people. There might be sort of, I don't know, some sort of community sense, and you could imagine if enough people care about it, big companies are going to maybe do more to care. You could imagine a rich company like Amazon or Microsoft, they're increasingly trying to make sure that their power is carbon neutral.
Yeah.
So there's going to be things that the sort of general pressure from people in tech is going to move those things in direction. There's a sort of, I don't think having a discussion about it at a conference is going to have much impact. Whereas if those same group of people was to actually campaign for nuclear power and do so consistently over a long period of time, and that became a movement, then that might fix it. So,
okay.
Yeah.
I see what you're saying. Okay. I don't fully agree, but I see what you're saying. So by that extension, do you sort of, have you, for example, supported the climate strikes personally or as a company? Is it okay for, does it make sense to you that people are doing this? And is it okay for, Redgate stuff, for example, to strike?
I mean, we try to keep out of the politics. I mean, quite a lot of the politics of people at Redgate, as you can imagine, are sort of, a prosperous middle-aged man. You can imagine I look at with horror at some of the politics of the younger people at my company. But that's their choice, and they're probably equally appalled by some of my views. So, got to be, I don't want to get into that with people. So, if you wanted to take a day's vacation and go and protest in London, I would disagree with you, but I mean, it's your choice. And I'm not going to do anything about that other than sort of shake my head ruefully at the stupidity of it all. But that's really your business.
Fob suddenly isn't working on Monday.
Yeah, if you've taken a day's holiday and you want to whatever, then that's fine. But my view is that the Extinction Rebellion and the sort of movement that's come out of sort of protests and strikes and things is massively ill-conceived. I mean, I think it's by the time you're stopping trains running in order to protest about, basically you're just trying to disrupt people's lives in order to get attention, and you're not doing anything constructive about the environment. So I think that in a way that's my central point actually that I'm making all along is you've got a whole lot of people wringing their hands, and really what they want to do is basically want to shut down Western prosperity, and we should all go back to some sort of simpler form of living that would somehow be better for the environment. And I think that is not the answer, and the answer is before us, which is to use forms of power generation that don't create carbon dioxide, which we have available to us right now. So rather than shutting London down and doing all sorts of weird things, we should focus on something that could actually solve the problem now. So I guess that's my view.
Okay, I mean, Extinction Rebellion is problematic. I don't personally fully agree with it, but it is a good way of raising disruption is a very good way of raising awareness about something, right? So
yeah, it is, but it's awareness of what? So they have a very exaggerated position about their position is in 20 years time we're all going to be dead because of something that we're doing now. And if you did truly believe that, I think that would be it would be sensible for many of us to be protesting about our current course of action and to do something about it. But even the most wild modeler doesn't think that's going to be the case, and so their prediction of the future is so deranged that it's foolish for the rest of us to get on board with that. What they're protesting about isn't something that actually any sensible person believes is going to happen, or anyone who actually understood the science or the models or any of it thinks is going to happen. So for us to be bent out of shape and to not do, it's this classic thing about the enemy of the solution is sort of this perfect answer. So it is true that there's a bit of risk with nuclear power. And it is true that gas does produce carbon dioxide compared to coal. But both gas and nuclear power are incredibly better than what the vast majority of the world is using right now to generate their electricity. Mm-hmm. So by refusing to embrace the solutions that could actually massively materially affect the situation, and instead go for some sort of weird, oh, everything has to be renewable, we should just shut up, we should stop flying in airplanes, and we should go back to some sort of simple life. That, by embracing only something which is unfeasible, we are doing the environment a massive disservice. And the second thing is that by not caring about the thing that really matters, which is habitat destruction, where right now in Britain, the British government subsidizes the chopping down of primary rainforest and turning that into wood pellets and shipping them over to what was coal-powered power stations, and putting those wood pellets into the coal-fired power station and making electricity out of it. I mean, to me, that is mad. But that is supported by Extinction Rebellion people, because it's carbon neutral. So, well, let's chop down the woods and have environmentally friendly power. It's like, no. We should be burning gas and making our power out of nuclear, and we should accept the fact that there's a tiny bit of risk with all that, and it's tiny bit less perfect, rather than saying, there's nowhere for this entire ecosystem to live anymore. So,
okay, I think
you get my point.
This has been one of the most exciting conversations I've had so far. Thank you, Simon. Hello, me again. Thank you for listening to the episode. I hope that was as interesting and useful for you as it was for me. As always, I encourage you to visit our website, fatalair.blog, to subscribe to our mailing list and find other ways to contribute and help us support the project. Thank you very much. I'll see you next time.